U.S. history, beginning its look at the Progressive Era and World War I. Beginning with Progressive Era, Chapter 20. The early 20th century was an era of business expansion and progressive reform here in the United States. The Progressives, as they called themselves, worked to make American society a better and safer place in which to live. They tried to make big business more responsible through regulations of various kinds, and worked to clean up corrupt city governments, to improve working conditions in factories, and to better living conditions, especially for those who lived in slum areas, a large number of whom were recent immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Many progressives were also concerned with the environment and conservation of resources. The single greatest factor that fueled the progressive movement in America was urbanization, and its related industrialization. For years, educated middle-class women had begun the work of reform in the nation's cities. The progressive movement started mostly at the beginning of the 20th century, though it had origins in the final decades of the 19th century. It sought to use the government to improve human welfare. Progressives fought monopolies, corruption, inefficiency, and fought for social justice. Urban intellectuals had already stirred the consciences of the American public with various controversial writings. Henry George attracted many followers by blaming inequalities in wealth on land ownership. His work in 1879 of Progress and Poverty, he suggested that profits made from land sales should be taxed at a rate of 100%. Edward Bellamy looked into the future with his 1888 novel Looking Backwards. The hero of the story wakes up in the year 2000 and looks back to see that all of the hardships of the Gilded Age have disappeared thanks to an activist utopian socialist government. And Jacob Riis, with his work How the Other Half Lives, started as a series of articles that, along with dozens of photographs, was later published as a book depicting the extreme poverty in the slums of New York. Riis was particularly suited to documenting this area because he had once lived in it, homeless and without a penny to his name, a poor immigrant from Europe. The print revolution would enable publications to increase their subscriptions dramatically, and what appeared in print was now more powerful than ever. Writing to Congress in hopes of correcting abuses was a slow and often produced zero results. But publishing a series of articles had a much more immediate impact. Collectively called the muckrakers, this group of reporters of the early 20th century exposed injustices so grave that they horrified the average American. Foremost among these 20th century muckrakers were Lincoln Steffens, Ida Tarbell, and Upton Sinclair. In 1902, Steffens published an article in McClure's magazine called Tweed Days in St. Louis. He exposed how city officials worked in league with big business to maintain power for themselves while corrupting the public treasury. More and more articles followed, and soon it was published as a book titled The Shame of the Cities. Public outcry demanded reform of city government and gave strength to the progressive ideas of a city commission or a city manager system. Ida Tarbell came next, just 1 month later, publishing her McClure series entitled The History of the Standard Oil Company. She outlined and documented the cutthroat business practices behind John D. Rockefeller's rise to power. Her motives might have also been quite personal, as her own father had been driven out of business by Rockefeller. Perhaps no muckraker caused as much of a stir, though, as Upton Sinclair. A socialist, Sinclair hoped to illustrate the horrible effects of capitalism on workers in the Chicago meatpacking industry. The Jungle detailed workers sacrificing their fingers and fingernails by working with acid, losing limbs, catching diseases, and working long hours in cold, cramped conditions. He hoped the public outcry would be so fierce that reforms would soon follow. But the clamor throughout America was not a response to the workers' plight, because Sinclair had also uncovered the contents of the products being sold to the general public. Spoiled meat was covered with chemicals to hide the smell. Skin, hair, stomach, ears, and nose was ground up and packaged as head cheese. Rats climbed over the warehouse meat, leaving piles of excrement behind. Sinclair had once said that he'd aimed for America's heart and instead hit it squarely in the stomach. Even President Roosevelt, who coined the term muckraker, was forced to act and launched an investigation, which confirmed Sinclair's findings. Within months, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act to curb these abuses of power. The progressives were urban, mostly from the Northeast, educated, middle-class, Protestant, reform-minded men and women. There was no actual official progressive party until 1912, but progressivism had already swept the nation, and it was more of a movement than a political party, because there was actually followers of the progressive ideals in both of the major parties. And there were three progressive presidents: Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt and Taft were Republicans, and Wilson was a Democrat. What united the movement, though, was a belief that the laissez-faire social Darwinist outlook of the Gilded Age was morally and intellectually wrong. Progressives believed that the people in the government had the power to correct abuses produced by either nature or the free market. The results of the progressive movement was astonishing. Seemingly every aspect of society would be touched by progressive reform. Workers and consumer issues were addressed, conservation of natural resource was begun, and the plight of the urban poor was addressed. National political movements like the temperance and women's suffrage found allies within the progressive movement. And the era produced a host of national and state regulation, plus 4 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Once the United States became involved in World War I, attention was diverted away from domestic issues and progressivism began to decline. While unable to solve the problems of all Americans, the progressive era would set the stage for the 20th century trend of having an activist government trying to assist the people. With such a wide group of people following this progressive philosophy, it's hard to believe that they had any sort of common goals, but for the most part they did. There were 4 main goals of the progressive movement: protecting social welfare, which means tackling the problems brought by industrialization, including providing government assistance for those in need; promoting moral improvement by targeting poverty, alcohol, and abuse with the goal of making changes in people's character; creating economic reform, which sought for the regulation of the economy by having the government change its policies towards business; and fostering efficiency by developing better business and government practices, which would hopefully lead to less corruption, and especially develop a more effective use of resources. Specifically, the progressives hoped to address the growing power of the trusts, big businesses, and corporations, and to provide regulations, to eliminate bribery and corruption associated with the political machines, and to bring about political reform, to address the issues of social injustice and inequality, and to bring reform there, and to raise awareness of those social injustices, things like child labor, the effects of illiteracy, alcohol abuse, and crime, to improve the lifestyles and living and working conditions of Americans by establishing things like health and safety codes, and to conserve and protect natural resources. This generation of Americans also hoped to make the world a more democratic place. At home, this meant expanding the right to vote to women, as well as a number of election reforms, such as the recall, the referendum, and the direct election of senators. Abroad, it meant that they needed to try to make the world safe for democracy. The goals of the progressives are really divided into those that were the national, state, and local level. At the national level, the populist ideas of an income tax and direct election of senators became the 16th and 17th Amendments. Continuing to expand the electorate, the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote, which was also a national level goal. Even the long-standing temperance movement saw a resurgence during the Progressive era, becoming the Prohibition movement, and resulted in the passage of the 18th Amendment, although the needs of soldiers and the Allies during World War I were necessary to secure the final passage of those last two amendments. The populist movement also influenced progressivism at the state and local level. While rejecting the call for free silver, progressives embraced the political reforms of the secret ballot, the initiative, the referendum, and recall. The secret ballot is self-explanatory. The initiative permitted voters to enact laws by petitioning to place an idea or an initiative on the ballot, a law that they could then approve themselves. A referendum allowed voters to counteract legislation by holding a special vote, putting an existing law on the ballot for the voters to either reject or approve. The third element of this direct democracy agenda was the recall. It would permit citizens to remove a public official from office through a process of petition and vote, similar to the initiative process. While this measure was not as widely adopted as the others, Oregon became the first state to allow recalls in 1910. And by 1920, the end of the Progressive era, 12 states had adopted this tool. Now, it's only been used successfully a handful of times at a statewide level. The governor of North Dakota, for example, was removed in 1921, and more recently, the governor of California in 2003. Now, most of these reforms were on the state level. Under the governorship of Robert La Follette, Wisconsin would become a laboratory for the experimentation of many of these political reforms. Another reform in the law involved the creation of the direct primary. Prior to this time, the only people who had a hand in selecting candidates for elections were the delegates at conventions. Direct primaries allowed party members to vote directly for a candidate, with the nomination going to the one who had the most votes. This was the beginning of the current system of holding a primary election before a general election. At the city and state level, reforms went further by trying to root out urban corruption by introducing new models of city government. The city commission and city manager systems removed important decision-making from politicians and put it in the hands of skilled technicians, often engineers. Progressives in large cities were particularly frustrated with the corruption and favoritism associated with machine politics, which wasted enormous sums of taxpayer money and ultimately stalled the progress of the cities for the sake of those politicians. They sought to change this corrupt system and had success in places like Galveston, Texas, where in 1901 they pushed the city to adopt a commission system. A hurricane the previous year had led to the collapse of the old city government, which had proved incapable of leading the city through the natural disaster and the rebuilding afterwards. That particular storm had claimed over 8,000 lives, the highest death toll from a natural disaster in the history of the United States. And afterwards, the community had no faith that its existing government could possibly rebuild. So instead, they opted to reform their government and adopted the commission system. The way a commission system works is you elect a number of commissioners, each of them responsible for one specific operation of the city, with titles like water commissioner, fire commissioner, police commissioner, etc., etc. So with no single political boss in charge, graft and corruption could be greatly reduced. Another model of city government reform would take shape in Virginia. In 1908, where the citizens there switched to a city manager form of government. Designed to avoid the corruption inherent with machine politics, the city manager system separated the daily operations of the city from both the electoral process and political parties. In this system, citizens elected city councilors who would pass law and handle all the legislative issues. But their first job was to hire a city manager to deal with the daily management of the city. This person, unlike the politicians, was an engineer or a business person who understood the practical elements of city operations and directly oversaw city workers. Currently, hundreds, thousands of cities have adopted this type of system, including some of the largest cities in the country, like Dallas and Phoenix.